You are all of you beneath me. I am a god, you dull creature, and I will not be bullied by that.
This is a scene from Joss Whedon's The Avengers. You've probably seen it before. In fact, you've probably laughed at it before. I know I did back in 2012, along with every single other person in the entire cinema. And realistically, how could we not? It was such a surprise, such a hilarious subversion of the classic villain monologue. I mean, think about it, it's literally the filmmakers picking up all the serious tropes we've become accustomed to over the past 100 years, and saying to the audience, hey, you and I have both seen this scene thousands of times before, right? We both know what you've come to expect from this stuff, so how about we just throw this formula around like a rag doll and try something new? And in the moment, this seemed like a really exciting proposition. I mean, come on, an era where stories are sentient? An era where movies know they are movies and which can therefore create this new age relationship between storyteller and audience. One which is interactive and two-sided, which knows our expectations and therefore knows how to play with and subvert them. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it turns out a few things. Lots of things, actually. Let me start by revisiting a story I briefly told in my recent video on Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, and why they remain virtually untouchable 20 years on. For some reason, I missed out on these movies throughout my childhood. I don't know why. It just never occurred to me that I should watch them. So by the time I did eventually sit down to view the trilogy, I think I was 17, and by then was very much accustomed to the cynical, self-aware, ironic style of storytelling which had grown throughout the 2010s to dominate movies, and to a lesser extent television as well. Now, to this day, I'm pretty ashamed by what I'm about to tell you, but anyway. Fellowship of the Ring begins, we hear Cate Blanchett's narration, and I'm thinking, okay, this is pretty cool. It's a bit overly serious, but whatever. And we get to the bit with Sauron, and we see this villain who kind of looks like he's from Power Rangers, and Galadriel is talking about a place called Mount Doom. So obviously I brace myself for the joke, for the moment where this ridiculous tension is broken. And it just doesn't come. So I think, fine, that was the prologue, whatever. You can't really make jokes in the prologue. Then we get the whole Shire sequence, and I see all these little guys running around the place, smoking weed and making these weird faces. It all feels rather camp, rather silly, especially once the wizard in the pointy hat arrives, and so once again I brace myself for the self-referential joke, for the film to acknowledge how bizarre this all is. And once again, no such joke occurs. And this basically happens for the entire trilogy. Like, you think I would have gotten used to the tone after a few scenes, but no. My brain had been so molded over time by so much postmodern wink-wink nudge-nudge storytelling that it could just not recognize sincerity. Now, let's actually stop for a second and think about how crazy that is, because sincerity is not some outlandish storytelling device, only used by those daring few writers and directors. No, sincerity, since the dawn of time, has been the very essence of storytelling itself. Like, imagine having this conversation with someone even 50 years ago. They probably wouldn't even understand what you were talking about. For millennia, stories were told to convey truths, to share human experiences, to evoke genuine emotion. From ancient myths and legends, to classic literature, to television and cinema, sincerity has been the core element that binds the audience to the narrative. It's the fundamental ingredient that allows us to resonate so deeply with stories. Sincerity is what makes characters relatable, struggles compelling, and triumphs uplifting. Now look, I'm not saying that every story has to be this serious thing which dramatically changes our lives. There is absolutely a place for humor, for irony, for stories that don't take themselves too seriously, for movies which know they are movies and have fun with that premise. In fact, this kind of storytelling can be incredibly refreshing and entertaining when done right. However, when this becomes the default, when every film in the cinema feels the need to follow trend by shying away from earnest emotions or genuine stakes, a lot of problems tend to arise. Problems which films with a more sincere approach would just never run into. First of all, that amazing thrill of having your expectations subverted, that rush of excitement you get when a movie is meta, self-aware, ironic, well, it has extremely diminishing returns. Like I said earlier, Everyone in the movie theatre laughed back in 2012 when Hulk picked up Loki and threw him around like a ragdoll, but I imagine if you watched that scene today, it just wouldn't be that funny. But why? Well, first of all, the joke has been done a million times since, in both every Marvel movie and basically everywhere else. But on top of this, every single one of these self-referential jokes are essentially the same, just with slightly different coats of paint. Like, sure, you can subvert expectations, break the fourth wall, play on pre-established tropes in as many different ways as you like, but let's face it, the joke is pretty much this. Hey, you're watching a film, and we know it. Like, that's it. That's the whole joke, done over and over and over again. And a huge problem with this formula, other than it becoming stale very quickly due to ridiculous overexposure, and it not being that clever or funny in the first place, is that it makes what is supposed to be unpredictable and subversive predictable and boring. And in my opinion, the single best example of this is Thor Ragnarok, a film which I personally find to be rather overrated. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like every single line or joke in Thor Ragnarok is some meta-ironic quip which winks at the audience, but a lot of them are, and they're so frequent that it doesn't take long for you to predict when they're coming, again because they're essentially all the same joke. Like, the movie starts with yet another villain monologue, and we have this joke where Thor slowly spins away from the villain, and yeah, it makes your nose exhale slightly, maybe. And then the film gets back to the villain monologue and you think, alright, well, let's hear what the guy has to say. And then they just do the exact same joke again, like 10 seconds later, and you just think, what's even the point of this? If you're just gonna pull the rug out from under me every single time, I'm gonna very quickly pick up on what you're doing and learn when to jump over said rug. Does that metaphor make sense? Like, the thing that made this tone somewhat work in the beginning is that it was surprising and unpredictable, but I'm afraid to say that that ship sailed long ago, leaving us with, well, what exactly? To be honest with you, I'm not really sure, but whatever it is, it feels quite nasty. You know? Like a trick is being played on us, like we're being gaslit by someone who doesn't really respect the audience, nor the material they're responsible for, which is kind of surreal to say out loud, but that's where we now find ourselves. Like, there's this one film which I'm sure no one's ever heard of before called The Last Jedi. I think it's the 8th episode of this epic space opera saga thing, and there's this one joke in it where we see this huge ship landing, and the cinematography and the music seem to be leading us to some big reveal. And then it turns out to be an iron. Like, it's an iron. Ironing some clothes. Now look, I can actually see how someone could find this moment kind of witty, and look, I'm not gonna argue against that. However, I would argue that the brief laugh this moment may perhaps offer is nowhere near worth what it takes away. Because this joke basically feels like the creators of The Last Jedi, whoever they may be, making fun of us and punishing us for taking any of this seriously. It almost feels nihilistic. In fact, no, what am I talking about? It is nihilistic. A moment like this wouldn't feel out of place in Spaceballs, you know, the film that was made to take the piss out of Star Wars. And now it's appearing in the real thing. Like, this is the point we've arrived at. There's a great video essay you should watch by The Closer Look about The Last Jedi's comedy, and in it they continuously bring up this word bathos, which basically means an anticlimax created by a lapse in mood from the sublime to the trivial or ridiculous. It's a film presenting us with something that could potentially be rather emotional or epic or dramatic, before pulling it away at the last second and going, we got you. You thought it was going to be serious, but we were one step ahead of you. If this sounds familiar, it's because it's basically appeared in every single modern blockbuster created within the Hollywood system. And it is this type of joke which I believe to have caused the single greatest problem of this entire meta-ironic era which Hollywood currently finds itself in. You know what I was saying earlier about how sincerity is the core element which binds audiences to stories? The fundamental ingredient that allows us to resonate so deeply with cinema? Well, then it would make sense that insincerity achieves the opposite, creating a barrier between the audience and the story that they're watching. It's funny really, because a movie acknowledging that it's a movie is usually referred to as breaking the fourth wall, yet I would argue that a better term would be strengthening or refortifying the fourth wall. And the more frequently this wall is acknowledged, the more sturdy and opaque this barrier between audience and film becomes, the more we all come to expect this ironic style of storytelling, the less we are going to want to emotionally invest in films in the first place. Because what's the point if every movie movie is just going to make fun of itself, make fun of you for ever thinking that it might take something seriously. This is why my initial reaction to The Lord of the Rings was one of confusion, because I was so used to films like these gaslighting me and making fun of me and making fun of themselves and consistently avoiding actual stakes or real emotions. When I was eventually met with Sincerity from a major studio blockbuster, I thought this must be some sort of trick. I'm not going to offer up my heart to this trilogy, to this experience, because, well, I've been hurt so many times in the past, and I know how this goes. The second I get invested in any of this, some hobbit is going to come out of a bush, smoking his pipe, and laugh at me for taking any of this seriously. And that, my friends, should just not be happening. Like, that is such an unnatural response to a piece of art. So, what is the solution to all of this? Because like I've already said, it's not that I think that this meta sort of humour doesn't have any place in modern cinema. Well, I have a few ideas. First of all, I don't really think movies can have their cake and eat it too when it comes to this stuff. Like, I find it so bizarre when the Deadpool movies, for example, which, let's be honest, essentially exist to make fun of superhero films, to break the fourth wall, and to have Ryan Reynolds make a ton of dick jokes. I find it so bizarre when even those movies are suddenly trying to form some sort of emotional connection. Like, no. Any attempt at sincerity feels so out of place when you've spent the entire runtime taking absolutely nothing seriously. Another Hollywood franchise which I think has sadly run into this problem is the Fast and Furious films. Now look, I know these movies, and most of the other movies I've spoken about in this video, are not exactly the pinnacle of cinema, but I do think that the Fast and Furious series is a pretty interesting case study when it comes to a franchise gaining self-consciousness, if you will, halfway through its lifespan. This series begun in the early 2000s as your standard illegal street racing Point Break ripoff. However, the series, in my opinion, did not hit its peak until its fifth installment, which came out in 2011, 1 year before Joss Whedon changed everything with the Avengers. Fast 5, for me, is not just the zenith of this franchise, but honestly, one of the best dumb action movies of the 21st century. Why? Well, because Fast and Furious was not yet this huge meme. The creators were not yet in on the joke. Yes, this film is stupid, but it also takes itself pretty seriously. The thing moves at a great pace, the set pieces are explosive and well directed, the characters are likable, but most importantly, it's earnest. It's not trying to make fun of itself. And because of this, it's actually rather wholesome. You find yourself really buying into all the vehicular masculine poetry in a way you probably just wouldn't ever expect to. And then the mid-2010s happened. The Fast and Furious franchise became aware of its own existence, of its own legend, of its own meme. The creators got in on the joke, and it lost what made it special in the first place. It became a parody of itself. And yeah, that kind of thing has happened before, but they still try to do the emotional stuff and it just doesn't work. It doesn't land because you can't really have it both ways. Or should I say, it's very difficult to have it both ways. I do think that on the rare occasion, when executed properly, you can have like one self-aware joke in your film. One instance where your movie recognizes that it's a movie, the audience laughs, and then we move on from it. A great example of this, sticking to the whole villain monologue thing, is this moment from The Incredibles.
You sly dog! You got me monologuing! I can't...
Now, this isn't the deepest, most meta joke ever told before, but it is funny. Why? Well, one, because it's really not that self-referential, like, let's be real, this is a pretty innocent joke. And two, the rest of The Incredibles is sincere. Sure, it has jokes, of course, it's a Pixar movie, but nothing too self-aware, nothing which takes you out of the experience, which stops you from emotionally investing into the stakes of the story. So again, I do think that you can include the odd meta joke in your movie if you really want to, but it needs to be handled incredibly delicately. Of course, what's probably easier than this is to just go full Charlie Kaufman and completely embrace the art of meta storytelling, or go full Tarantino and wholeheartedly embrace the art of homage. And I have indeed had tons of fun with films like these, but if you're not willing to go all the way with this stuff, perhaps just stick to the original source of storytelling. Pure, unfiltered sincerity. This doesn't mean abandoning humor altogether. but rather ensuring that it serves to enhance the emotional depth and authenticity of the narrative, rather than detracting from it. Fortunately for us, there does seem to be a growing trend in Hollywood at the moment that seems to signal a return to this sincere approach. Movies like Top Gun Maverick and Dune Part 2 have demonstrated that studios are once again down to craft narratives that are earnest and emotionally resonant, and I think the audience response to both of those films says a lot about what we truly want from this beautiful medium deep down. Perhaps we'll never get another Lord of the Rings, a series you'll be glad to hear I now love and appreciate with all my heart. But in this quest to reclaim the forgotten currency of sincerity, we might have gotten something even better. We might just rediscover that the most epic tales are the ones that dare to be genuine, to be earnest, to embrace the sublime beauty of unfiltered truth. You're waiting for me to make a joke, aren't you? To relieve the tension after that emotional monologue? Well, I'm not going to. Thanks for watching.